Greetings, students. Welcome to Complexity Fuel. My name is Mr. Little, and today I'm looking at this map, which hopefully you've seen yourself at some point. It's actually a pretty common map in a lot of AP World textbooks. This is a map that shows the travels of the Islamic jurist Ibn Battuta in the mid-14th century. Now, what's really interesting about this map, if you'll notice all of his various journeys, is that with the exception of a few particular spots, he was pretty much always in Dar al-Islam, that is the realm of Islam where either Muslim rulers reigned or the majority of the population was Muslim. And that's pretty extreme when you think about it. This huge swath of the world was in the same cultural zone. And the spread and the rise of Islam as a religion after the 700s is a big theme of AP World and the consequences of that spread. And we usually talk about cultural exchange and cultural connections as either good or benign things, but today we're going to make that a little more complicated in the West African context. Before we get this complicated, what do you need to know about cultural connections in Africa in Unit 2? Officially, you need to know that the expansion of empires, including Mali in West Africa, facilitated Afro-Eurasian trade and communication as new people were drawn into the economies and trade networks. So that seems pretty straightforward. More empires, more cultural expansion means more trade networks, right? Pretty benign. Well, not so fast. Let's make it complicated by talking about something called negative externalities. If you are a student of economics, you know that a negative externality is when a third party is injured or damaged by the activities of two parties. So one example of negative externalities is pollution, right? Pollution is a negative externality because it harms a third party. We're going to explore some negative externalities. First, we got to talk really quick about the Trans-Saharan Trade Route. So the Trans-Saharan Trade Route is actually not new to Unit 2. The Trans-Saharan Trade Route has actually been in operation since Roman times. But what began to happen after the spread of Islam was that the Trans-Saharan Trade Route intensified, which meant it was used more than it had previously been used. Now, why was that? Well, when a trade route historically intensifies, it can be for a couple reasons. It can be technological innovations, cultural shifts, shifts in economic demand, political changes. It could be a combination of all of those things. In the case of the Trans-Saharan Trade Route, two of the largest factors for intensification was the spread of the camel from Arabia, along with camel saddle technology, as well as the spread of Islam from North Africa down to West Africa. And that's kind of nicely summed up here in this picture from the Catalan Atlas, where you see trade links across the Sahara, a camel, as well as the Islamic king Mansa Musa with his gold nugget, gold being one of the most famous trade items on the Trans-Saharan Trade Route. So trade networks intensify. One of the negative externalities of the intensification of the Trans-Saharan Trade Route was an intensification of slavery. When we think about more trade on trade routes, we usually just think of more goods, right? More porcelain, more silk, more glass, more spices. But unfortunately, those things all have to be made. So that would be an intensification of labor. And in the case of slaves being the product, right, this would be an incentive to get more slaves. Notice when you look at the states of West Africa, like the large empires of the Sahel, each one was progressively larger than the last. Each one actively participated in the trans-Saharan trade. One of the sort of consequences of larger empires and larger trade meant there was more demand and more incentive to create human labor in the form of slavery. Well, we don't have exact numbers for what percentage of the populations were either slaves or were enslaved in the great West African states. Some contemporary scholars estimate it may have been anywhere from a quarter to perhaps a third of individuals in these empires were enslaved or had become slaves. And it didn't even necessarily mean that they were slaves for export to another place. In some cases, it was that they were enslaved to do more work for a good that was being produced for export, such as gold or salt, both of which were major exports on the Trans-Saharan trade routes. Now, there's another particular kind of slavery that reminds us how this context is a little bit different than, say, the transatlantic slavery that we're going to see later on, and that is the concept of the Mamluk. Now, the Mamluk or Mamluk are the slave soldiers that served in many smaller Islamic states around what is now the Middle East, what's now parts of Iran, what's now parts of Central Asia. And that was because these Islamic rulers didn't trust their own local populations to fight loyally for them. And so they would import these soldiers from somewhere else, usually North Africa or the Caucasus. And so what you could say is maybe one of the negative externalities about the rise of so many smaller Islamic states in the Islamic world was that it intensified the trade for Mamluk slave soldiers. Now, what's interesting is that the scholar Al-Umari actually visited the kingdom of Mali in West Africa right after the reign of Mansa Musa, the famous king who went on his pilgrimage to Mecca. Al-Umari's description of Mali. He said that the Sultan had about 30 slaves standing behind him, which included Turks and others who are bought for him in Egypt. And so this definitely tells us that there was a thriving slave trade, not just going out of Africa to North Africa, but coming from North Africa and even further afield in the Islamic world back into Mali and the states of West Africa. So when we discussed sort of the negative externalities about the spread of culture and the spread of economic networks of exchange, when could you use this information? Well, if you have an essay that's about trade networks, expanding trade networks, new networks of exchange, or the expanding cultural zones, these negative externalities, in the case of the Trans-Saharan Trade Route, would be a great way to make your essay just a little bit more complex. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.